If you're a business owner or senior manager, you probably had more than enough about all the wonderful opportunities awaiting you in the era of digitalization.
Whether it is big data, cloud, data science, or whatever buzzword is currently trendy.
If you would like to hear someone dissecting these claims and showing you what it actually takes to improve business processes, you're in the right place.
This is Between Data and Risk, where we discuss real-life examples of what works and what doesn't in the world of business operations.
Hello, I'm your friendly neighborhood data guy, Dr. Marian Siwiak. Welcome to Between Data and Risk. Today we'll have a look at ideas, openness and blockchain, and we have with us Lorien Gamaroff of Centbee, who agreed to share some of his experiences with us. Hello, Lorien.
Hello, Dr. Siwiak. Nice to meet you and be on your show.
Thank you for coming. You're pretty outspoken about what you do. You have a lot of public exposure, so to speak. So I'm glad that you also decided to share with our audience some of your ideas. Let's start with introduction of Centbee. Especially, I'm interested in the problem that you are solving. As I mentioned offline, last couple of episodes, we tried to maybe put a bit more emphasis on why the things are being done rather than only how. So the floor is yours. What is the Centbee and why Africa needs it, and not only Africa, but who needs it and why?
Yeah. Well, I guess you could put it into that category of a financial inclusion tool. And of course, being based in Africa, one of the important things about Africa is really the access to financial services that Europeans and people in the West and the East, of course, have access to. And Africa, it's largely, the whole continent is developing, and financial services are still that thing that a lot of Africans don't have access to. And so about 14 years ago, in 2011, I was working in an energy startup, and one of the things that we were trying to find was a way for Africans who don't have access to credit cards or bank accounts can buy electricity, because here in Africa people tend to pay as you go. So they'll buy electricity up front and then load their meter and then use it, consume it. Whereas obviously the other way is consuming and then getting a bill at the end of the month. But in Africa, it's difficult to recover costs, so you get this prepaid system of electricity. And that's when I first heard about Bitcoin, because Bitcoin wasn't really understood, really was talking about it, except for, of course, the dark web, something that was now becoming quite frightening for a lot of people in the regulatory space. Now, I saw Bitcoin really for what it originally was supposed to be, which was this digital cash system. And also what people didn't realize then and still don't realize to this day is that Bitcoin was always meant to be a regulatory compliant cash system. Of course, now I live in a world of crypto, and people are looking at crypto as a new form of money, something that can
laundering.
Yes, something that can sidestep the regulators and law enforcement, and it's become something that is really the antithesis of what the original idea of Bitcoin should be. But I then integrated it into our vending system, and that meant that people could use Bitcoin to buy electricity. Now, those are the early days, and most people hadn't even heard about it. And so to try and get my users who are using the system to use Bitcoin as a payment method, that needed to be overcome. And so a few years later, after a few other companies that I co-founded and founded in the blockchain space, I decided to build a wallet company where users could download a wallet and they could easily get a Bitcoin onto their mobile phones. And then they could use it like mobile money. And mobile money is really massive across the continent, the African continent. Of course, in Asia, people use WeChat and all that. But Africa really is where the mobile money story is taking off. More and more Africans are getting access to mobile phones, cheap phones, smartphones, and data access is growing. And so Africans are pretty much leapfrogging the whole banking system and traditional financial sector and moving straight into mobile money. So I thought it was just the perfect time, the perfect opportunity to get into mobile money, as well as using Bitcoin, the digital cash version, so that people could then buy things like electricity. And so Sentbee grew out of that. And now Sentbee is trying to be a kind of fully fledged super app where people can send money cross-border to their family and friends around the world, obviously specifically focused on Africa, but it is a global product. And then do other things like purchase digital goods maybe get Uber or even shop at brick and mortar retailers and other things like that, and peer-to-peer cash, of course, as well. So that's been my journey, is trying to bring Bitcoin to Africa. But of course, what happened along the way is that the message kind of drifted into this crypto message, which was now not about trying to create a digital cash system, but some form of digital money that was decentralized, and the word decentralized becoming to mean something that governments couldn't control. There was no oversight. And really, crypto has changed the conversation and stolen away what people really should have been focusing on in the first place, something that can reduce the costs of transactions and, of course, create a transparent system, albeit private, that regulators and governments could be happy with. Now, of course, governments and regulators and law enforcement are very unhappy with crypto because, as I said, people have been deviating away from the original Bitcoin into these crypto products, which really are trying to become anonymous and ungovernable. So it's pretty sad for that. But, as well as this business, I spent a lot of time going to many, many conferences all around the world, industry conferences, government conferences, fintech conferences, trying to explain that the Bitcoin blockchain, the original version, because there are now many versions of Bitcoin, was always meant to be a tool for financial inclusion and something that they can embrace rather than tolerate at this stage.
Okay. What you said actually brings one thought and a couple of questions. The thought is America was stuck with pagers for the longest time because they've been on the forefront of, I would say, technology development. And cell phones had pretty hard time, and smartphones breaking the pager domination because they were stuck. Similarly, when the internet was brought and fiber cables, optical fibers, I think many underdeveloped countries like Eastern Europe, they jumped onto fiber cables instead of being stuck with the copper wires. Living in London for a couple of years, I was living a couple of kilometers from London, and I had this 2 megabit copper wire because it was there, it was used, and nobody was planning to upgrade. The upgrade is much more expensive and hard than jumping into what's maybe the second generation. So I guess the Africa with the mobile money, I've heard about it before. The Africa is very, very heavily leaning on the mobile money. I think we had it in one of our episodes. The question, when we are talking about Bitcoin, you mean in general cryptocurrencies, or is it just hard Bitcoin and you cannot send Ethereum there or anything else? Or like, how does it work? Are you stuck with Bitcoin, or are you also allowing or promoting different cryptocurrencies or blockchain currencies?
Right. When you say the word Bitcoin today, you have to clarify what you mean, because as I said, there are many different versions of Bitcoin. And what people call Bitcoin today, or BTC, which is listed on exchanges, isn't in fact the original protocol or design of Bitcoin. It's an alternative version, even though it has the same ticker symbol as what Bitcoin had originally. There are in fact now 3 dominant versions of Bitcoin, or main versions. One is the BTC version. There's another version that forked off a few years ago called Bitcoin Cash. And what Bitcoin Cash was trying to achieve was the low cost nature of Bitcoin, because the BTC Bitcoin, the changes they made there was to artificially limit the block size, which meant that transactions cost a lot more. And that's because they're trying to go for that digital gold thing. But then there is another main version of Bitcoin which very few people know about, and in fact isn't very much liked in the crypto sphere, and it's called the Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision version of Bitcoin, or at least what Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin, originally released.
Wherever he is.
Yes, wherever he is. Although it turns out it's not much of a mystery today at all. Maybe we can touch on that. But the Satoshi Vision, or what we call BSV, the Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, that is in fact the original Bitcoin protocol that has remained unchanged from what Satoshi released, and which is meant to be regulated digital cash. Now, BTC, which is the one that everybody knows about as Bitcoin on the exchanges, of course, that's the one that's $100,000 and isn't trying to be digital cash. It's trying to be what everyone calls digital gold, which, if you think about it, for something to be valuable, of course, it has to be useful, not just scarce. And BTC are trying to sell people this narrative that just because there's a scarce digital asset, it somehow has these wonderful magical properties. But
this is something that apologies for interrupting you, but
Oh.
I'll explode if I want. NFTs.
yes.
The whole Facebook Meta, I can't remember, 10, 40 billion investment into metaverse. We were exploring the space with my friend and business partner. And the longer we looked at metaverse, the more it looked like just NFT bubble. We never entered it because we couldn't understand how. To be honest, I still a bit struggle with Bitcoin and blockchain. I will ask you to clarify to me, why would anyone pay real hard-earned money for, a string of numbers that are unique? I can take my pen and, write them down, right? So this is the scarcity, this artificial scarcity. I think it brought death to NFTs and the whole metaverse idea that was largely developed on blockchain and NFTs. What prevents even this Bitcoin Satoshi version or vision from becoming just that, a string of numbers that somebody wakes up and say, I can't really eat it or store it, especially in Africa, where I guess the value needs to be transferable. Of course, let's be clear, there are countries which are pretty well developed there. And when we are talking about Africa, we are probably oversimplifying, and there are cities and countries which are at the level with some Eastern European countries. I can't remember. Gabon, I think, is one example. The question is, most of the people living in Africa, they need to be sure that if they put their money into their wallet, they will be able to buy something for it because it's not surplus, it's not investment or manipulation, financial manipulation tool. How does this Bitcoin Satoshi vision mitigate the risks that they take by turning actual money into these virtual ones?
Yes, just to finish off the question, the first one. So Centbee only uses digital cash, which means we only use the BSV version of Bitcoin because of the low cost nature of Bitcoin SV. So now to your point about money and things that are valuable and of course NFTs. Now, when you think about Bitcoin, people think of it as money, and that is not entirely accurate. And that's also why you can't think of it as money. Money is something that is, the money we have today, of course, we look at dollars and all that. Those are currencies. And generally currencies are either fiat, meaning government is, telling you to use them and you have to pay your taxes, which means there's a demand for them, or that they are actually intrinsically valuable, like gold. And currencies in the old days used to be linked to gold. Now, when it comes to the blockchain as a cash system, what's very important is that when you think about blockchain, you mustn't think of it as just a money system. It's not just money. It's actually what we call a protocol. And the internet itself is a protocol. And a protocol just means the way the system works, a design for the system, or the rules of a system. And the way the internet works is that it has a protocol called TCP/IP. And that just governs how information moves around the network. Then what we get is we get businesses like Google and Facebook who build apps on top of it so that we can start communicating and using that protocol. Now, Bitcoin is exactly the same. It's also just a network protocol. And instead of information like videos and chats and all that, it's actually transactions that are moving on this network. So that means that this network is just a network like the internet where businesses can create apps that can be useful to us. So in the case of transactions like Sentbee allows you to use the blockchain to be able to create transactions. And that's it. What those transactions are, whether they are money or not, that's a different question. Now, what makes the system valuable? And why would you want to acquire a Bitcoin token? Because if you want to use the ledger, for whatever reason, for that transactional nature, you have to acquire the tokens. Because it's another word for blockchain is a ledger, distributed ledger. It means that we can write information to the ledger. And one of the cool things about blockchain is that when you write information, it stays there forever. Also, it's traceable. So every time you create transactions, they are linked to one another. Now, that makes it very useful for all sorts of business activities. For example, in the traceable, if we think about traceability, if you think about supply chains need to track goods through a vast, complicated network of deliveries and warehouses and all that sort of thing. And so if you want to have a reliable system that can reliably trace products through a supply chain, having a ledger like a blockchain is a very good tool, because anybody can connect to that ledger. It's not a proprietary ledger, and they can then independently verify where products are in a supply chain. So it's great when you have lots of different parties all connecting to each other around this universal ledger for supply chains. But to be able to write information, those enterprises who are leveraging that supply chain, the blockchain for supply chain, they're going to need to acquire the token. Now, when you have a system that is useful, in other words, a ledger that people want to write to, and there are a limited number of tokens, it means that we have supply and demand. If a lot of businesses want to leverage the blockchain to write supply chain data, or data that can verify the integrity of documents or other data, because of the immutable data that you can put on the blockchain, if people start valuing the blockchain as a ledger, an enterprise ledger that is global and universal, that different companies can reliably connect to and share information, then that ledger is going to become useful and the token will grow in demand. And if we have that dynamic, you can see how now with supply and demand, there should be some kind of market price for that token to be able to use that ledger. So without utility, without being able to use the ledger for business activities apart from money, the blockchain will never be useful to anybody. And also what's so important is that that ledger must be very, very low cost, because if it's expensive, then businesses will choose something else.
This is my question, because the problem with one of the problems that I've heard about the Bitcoin is, first of all, it's very limited in number of tokens you are able to generate throughout history, and generating each subsequent one is more expensive than the previous one. That's why mining Bitcoin, I think, suddenly became responsible for like 2% of global warming and using more electricity than average-sized country. That's why I think Ethereum was conceived, and some other cryptocurrencies, that due to the nature of the protocol that you described, the likelihood of finding next token is a bit higher, and there is more of them. This curve of effort to mine Bitcoins is a bit lower. How is original? Let's maybe explain why Bitcoin costs anything. Because if you are writing something to a regular database, okay, it costs some money, but its single transaction is, I would say, negligible in cost. It's just, you just change 0 to 1 in the database. So maybe you want to explain to our audience why any cryptocurrency has this hidden cost, which is a bit different than just the cost of electricity of writing something to database or in the file.
Yes, and what you're referring to is the BTC version of Bitcoin, because that is the one that is famously so energy intensive and energy wasteful, because people have calculated that per transaction it costs X amount of kilowatt hours, and so the energy expended per transaction is extremely high. And that's because the BTC Bitcoin, what they've done is they've artificially limited how many transactions can get through. They've fixed the block size, which is the group of transactions that get processed every 10 minutes, to a 1 megabyte block, which means you can only have at most 5 or 6 transactions per second. And so there's an enormous cost of energy to process just a very few transactions. And of course, fees are high because there are only limited number of transactions that can go into a block every 10 minutes. And so if you want your transaction into the next block, you're going to have to outcompete everybody else or with fees, because miners will select the highest fee transactions. Now
Let's I'll explain it in a bit more detail because not everybody knows how the blockchain actually works. So I will try to say it in layman terms, and you will tell me where I'm wrong. Because I'm also not an expert, so I think it's best if I try to explain it. So there are people who make transactions and they want this to be put in the ledger. As you said, we consider blockchain as a ledger of transactions. So you say that every 10 minutes, there's only 1 megabyte of transaction data, which needs to have information who made a transaction, to whom, and what is the value of the transaction. So we package it, and where does this price come from? Why it's not just written to the database? To my understanding, there is a certain number that describes the content of this transaction depending on the content of this transaction, which is, for some reason, you need to find a random number that multiplied by the, checksum of this content gives you a number of a certain properties. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, let's simplify it without getting into the mathematics. So essentially what happens is that miners, what they're doing every 10 minutes, they are collecting transactions into a block, so all the world's transactions into a block, and then what they do is they start that proof of work process. And so because the BTC Bitcoin blockchain has a limited number of transactions that can be put into a block, as we said, it's about 1 megabytes worth of transactions, it means that miners are selecting transactions with the highest fees. Because people, if you want to send me a Bitcoin BTC transaction and you want to make sure that it gets processed into the next block for whatever reason, you're going to have to add a fee onto that transaction so that miners will look at
gas,
it.
Right?
So yes.
Gas.
Well, in Ethereum, there's gas, but let's just think about BTC. It's a bit simpler. What happens is you create a transaction in your wallet. Now, you want to broadcast that transaction to the network so that miners pick it up. Miners are then dealing with many, many transactions, and they can only fit a certain number into that next block. So what the miners do is they go on and look at every transaction that's been broadcast onto the network. And because
it's more expensive.
Yes, and you see, because they earn income. You see, what happens is if they process a block, they earn the fees on those transactions. So a miner
processing blocks is more and more expensive as well, because of this mathematics, each block is a bit more random, but the probability because processing of this block is computationally expensive. It's not like just writing it, they agree on it. They need to select random numbers, and one of them fits the bill, so to speak.
Yes.
If I understand correctly.
Yes, we call that the proof of work. That's the process that the miner goes through, which, like you say, it's finding a random number. But the miner, though, in the BTC Bitcoin, what they're doing is they know they can only fit a certain number of transactions. And so they will go and select the highest fees on transactions, and then they will include those into their block so that they can earn those fees. That's how the economic model of Bitcoin, that's how it works. Miners collect transactions into blocks, and if they process the block with that proof of work, they then earn the fees. Now, because BTC is limited in the block size, which was never the intention for Bitcoin, they are always going to be selecting the highest fee transactions. And so that naturally means that fees become higher and higher, $5, $10, $20 per transaction, which is unusable. Unless, of course, you have this idea that BTC isn't meant to be used as cash, it's just meant to be digital gold, and you just put it into a vault and you never care about it thereafter. So BTC itself, what has happened with BTC is they have taken the original idea of Bitcoin, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to strip it from the utility from the network and only create a digital gold system that is very high cost, because they believe that that is the only way they can keep the system maximally decentralized so that governments can't interfere. And so BTC has this ideology that they want to maintain government resistance. They don't want government oversight, and they certainly don't want law enforcement to come in and shut down miners and stop the whole system. That's what has become the BTC ideology, which is decentralization, ungovernableness. They use words like uncensorable transactions and unstoppable transactions, unconfiscatable. You know, they want to create a system that is free from government control, which is completely different from what Satoshi Nakamoto wanted in Bitcoin. Now, the BTC blockchain is that one that consumes an enormous amount of electricity for a very few number of transactions. And so on the face of it is extremely inefficient and is something that there should be a concern about. Because why would we want a system that is so energy intensive? What is it actually achieving? Not much at all. But in the original idea of Bitcoin was that there wouldn't be a limit to the number of transactions that were put into blocks. Blocks were unbounded. In other words, as many transactions as the miner wants to include, he can do so.
Everything that goes in over this 10 minutes, it goes there. It's megabyte, gigabyte, terabyte. You still need to find this number, but you find the number not for a megabyte of data, but for whatever is collected over the time.
Exactly. And so the cost per transaction, the energy cost per transaction, goes down to a tiny, tiny fraction of what it does in the BTC system. And if you even do a proper evaluation, you can see that even the cost per transaction in the Bitcoin Satoshi Vision network is lower than what banks could do or what other payment service providers could do. So the energy cost is actually incredibly low for Bitcoin as properly envisioned by Satoshi Nakamoto and not actually an issue.
I have a different question. So we explained how your version of blockchain is not a power hog, but is actually putting $20 per transaction fee on the users. There are other, I would say, solutions for sending money even internationally. Like, I'm not sure if Revolut, Wise, that I personally use, they just have their accounts in different countries and they just put money in one bank, and without sending them, they send it somewhere else. What's the benefit of using even this, let's say, poor man's Bitcoin version over solutions that rely on a banking system? Because I know that in one of these global banks, they calculated that if they would want to use the model used by Wise, they would lose like 20% of the turnover because of absolutely exorbitant transfer fees. But if they would want to, they are waiting for these solutions to be popular enough, so they have to go down with their absolutely ridiculous prices. But what's the difference between using the system that is still rooted in a banking system and Sentbee, which is rooted in blockchain? What is the benefit, or why is it good for Africa, for example?
Yes, and we started off talking about blockchain being very similar to the internet. And the way that blockchain eventually will be used is exactly the same way that the internet will be used. And you mentioned Revolut and you mentioned banks. What do banks and Revolut use today? They use the internet. And they use the internet to communicate and to do all the things that they need to run their business. And that is exactly what is going to happen with blockchain. In the same way banks use the internet today, this public network for communications, and Revolut the same, the blockchain is the missing piece of the internet that people have been waiting for since the birth of the internet. If you think about the HTTP protocol, there's a very famous code 404. When you find a website that's down, it says error 404, web page not found. But there is actually a code that has never been used on the internet, which is the 402 error. And if you Google it, you'll see that it's the payment required or missing payment code. But there's never been a native payment system built into the internet. And that's why we've had to use credit cards, and that's why PayPal came along, and all these other services are around the traditional ways of making payments, because the internet never had a native cash system. And the Satoshi Bitcoin that he created was, in fact, the missing piece of the internet protocol that could now finally facilitate cash payments. In other words, money that's not being pulled out of an account, but money that can be sent and pushed into somebody else's account. And that means that you eliminate a lot of fraud, because when you're pulling money out of somebody's account, like with a credit card or a debit order, that's where fraud can take place. And that's why the internet, in fact, even in 2000, the reason why we had the dot-com crash is because people were very reluctant to put their credit card details onto these merchant websites. So you must think about the Bitcoin as not being this system that is now outside of banking and outside of the traditional financial networks. Bitcoin SV is supposed to become now the missing piece of the internet puzzle, where companies like Revolut will use that system to be able to facilitate transfers and other kinds of payments. Banks will be able to issue their currencies, and even central banks, if we think about what are called central bank digital currencies, they will now be able to leverage the Bitcoin blockchain to be able to reduce the costs of payments, to be able to eliminate fraud, to be able to create transparency and traceability, to be able to facilitate anti-money laundering, all those very important things that banking and the traditional financial services industry struggle with today. This is why it's so exciting. It's not something that is going to come and take over and disintermediate everybody. It's just another network protocol. But unfortunately, the whole narrative around crypto blew it all up into this thing that it never was meant to be, and by the way, is unsustainable. Crypto has the seeds of its own destruction sown within it. The fact that it's trying to be maximally decentralized and even anonymous. Some of these cryptos, they're trying to remove the traceability. Even BTC. One of the most important things that BTC did to change Satoshi's design was they removed the digital signatures out of the transactions. And if you know anything about the world, it's so important to have signatures attached to documents, even digital signatures to be attached to documents and transactions, to be able to confirm identity and provide traceability. So even BTC has fundamentally changed Bitcoin to make it less likely to be adopted by banks and anything like that, because it's fundamentally, you can't regulate it. Now, of course, there's a lot of hype.
Your version of this Bitcoin Satoshi vision,
Yep.
It still has digital signatures, and these signatures can be linked to actual identification of legal and private persons. So
Yes.
actually, how it is, I don't know, if I am a governing authority, let's talk about regulation for a minute. Am I able to identify, do I have a chance to know who made the transaction? Because digital signatures, like anything, can be probably forged, especially when we are talking about the international transactions. So I have someone from some other country sending money to, because I understand that if I would issue these digital signatures to my citizens, like, I don't know, social security number or a passport number or, a personal identification number. So I guess I can imagine a situation where the country takes care of issuing the numbers to their own citizens. Would they have, but if the other countries would have the same databases, they would probably be able to check that it's actually governable, now that I think of it.
Bitcoin was meant to be governable and to comply with rules around identity. And that is why it's what's called a pseudonymous network, not an anonymous network. Pseudonymous means that transactions can be private, which is absolutely legal and appropriate for us to have private transactions. But in the event that we need to then expose that information to a governing body or an audit or anything like that, we then have the ability to then provide that information to whoever, and they can then independently audit and see what's going on. Now, when you say, how would you link those identities? And you were talking about signatures. Now, if you think about a bank, what a bank does is it takes your identity and it knows who you are. It's got your ID document, it's got your name and your photo and your address and who you are. And then it links that identity to your bank account. And that means every single transaction that goes in and out of that bank account is linked to your identity. And the way Bitcoin is supposed to be used is in the same way through accountable institutions like Sentbee. So when you create a Sentbee account and you have a wallet, what we do is we do a KYC. We get your documents, we verify your identity, and then we link that identity to your signatures, if you like, on the blockchain. And that means that when there's an audit or a regulator wants to come along or a taxman wants to come along, they can say, please tell us this person what transactions they're linked to, and then they can go and independently audit and trace and track every single one of your transactions. So that is how Bitcoin was meant to be used. The signatures were meant to always be linked to individuals and identities and businesses and whomever. And that means then through the accountable institutions, regulators can then have confidence that they can now trace and track payments through the system. That is why Bitcoin was built the way it is. But of course, BTC and crypto have the history of those blockchains have been moving away from that compliance.
Okay. Another question that pops to my mind is Bitcoin has quite high volatility, and those cryptocurrencies, which I'm now talking about cryptocurrencies as financial mechanisms, not as a protocol. They have quite high volatility. How do you protect your users from, is Bitcoin Satoshi Vision free of this, or is it an inherent risk that, needs to be accepted, or can it be mitigated somehow? I don't know.
Well, the only reason it exists today is because we have this plethora of cryptos and exchanges out there that are propagating this narrative around investment. But really, crypto exchanges are just casinos, and people use them like casinos. And so they are pumping and dumping, and of course, a lot of these exchanges are unregulated, so there's all sorts of things going on behind the scenes, wash trading, and who knows what else. And so it's just a big speculative, chaotic mess. And that, unfortunately, has meant that, yes, there is a lot of volatility, and that volatility will never go away as long as this whole system prevails. Now, again, if you think about the internet, we have one internet. We've got one network protocol that the entire world uses. And there are reasons for that. It's much more efficient to have a single network that we can all use rather than having friction, as we jump between networks. Same thing with blockchain. The ultimate way this is going to end, I believe very strongly, and also it's because I went through the evolution of the internet. My first businesses were on the internet. I watched the internet evolve, and there were multiple networks at the time, and eventually the world consolidated onto a single network. Ultimately, what will happen is the world is going to consolidate onto a single blockchain, and that is that blockchain, the value of the token.
Aren't all blockchains limited in number of tokens that they generate? Isn't there this curve of number of possible blockchains?
Yes, every blockchain.
I don't know. I'm asking.
Yes, every blockchain has its own design, and they've got their own number of tokens. Some tokens are limited, some are not. They've got all their own different models and all that. But I'm just talking about a distributed ledger protocol, one that the world one day will use for data, for transactional data. Crypto they are not trying to be that blockchain, even though, like you say, there are blockchains like Ethereum that are trying to become more like utility networks that people can build smart contracts and do all sorts of stuff on. The only problem with even Ethereum is that they don't work. Nobody has been able to beat Satoshi Nakamoto's original design, and this is why people say that he deserves a Nobel Prize in economics, because he was the one who finally solved the problem of a decentralized network that could be trusted, where you couldn't have double spending and the things that make digital cash difficult. He figured it out, and so all these other cryptos, they are just variations on the theme, and all of them, there's not one single blockchain out there that is demonstrating scale and regulatory compliance apart from the BSV blockchains. So the irony of this whole crypto scene that we're in right now is that it's ultimately, I think, going to consolidate back to the original version of Bitcoin. Now, we had the same kind of thing that happened in 2000. In those days, there was a lot of speculation around dot-coms, and people were buying and selling and trading dot-coms on the NASDAQ, and it was all going bananas. And what happened? It all collapsed because there was just speculation and no foundation. But companies like Google and Amazon, they were persisting, and they were steadily building value, apps that people wanted to use on the internet. And of course, look where we are today. And I think that I see a pattern. To me, it's deja vu. When I see the history of blockchain, because I was there right in the beginning, I've watched it all the way through to this day, and it just looks and smells and feels just like the dot-com bubble, where people are speculating on which cryptos and which blockchains, which one's going to work, and ultimately that original protocol is going to succeed. Now, when that happens, we're not going to have people speculating on tokens. There isn't going to be, there aren't going to be exchanges in the way that we see them today.
It will be a protocol.
Yes, it's just an internet protocol, a network protocol. And the only supply and demand dynamic that will come into play is businesses and users just using the ledger for day-to-day activities, making cash payments, or for writing information. NFTs you mentioned. NFT, really, the way they're used today, of course, it seems like nonsense. It's just these JPEGs and silly things. But all an NFT really is a digital certificate. And digital certificates can be used for all sorts of things. Like if you think about tickets for concerts or sports, it's an ownership, a certificate of ownership. And when you have ownership over something, you have rights to something. So if it's correctly applied to assets, like maybe you can have an NFT that represents a work of art that only you're allowed to access and only you're allowed to, or a movie ticket that only you can watch the movie if you have the token. Maybe a certificate that represents your motor car or your house. That's the proper way that NFTs will be used. Of course, this craze of buying JPEGs and trading, that's just another speculative mania. So, unfortunately, the world has gone bonkers over crypto, and it's really just hiding the fact that there's this incredible useful protocol, something that we've been needing for 40 years since the internet has been around. But the reality of it and the usefulness of it has been clouded by this crypto mayhem. And of course, the whole Bitcoin saga is the worst of it all. As I said, the BTC blockchain that everybody is trading, $100,000, digital gold, BlackRock, ETFs, all this craziness is just keeping the real value of BSV, the Satoshi version of Bitcoin, hidden from us, which is sad.
I'm very grateful. I must say that I've been approached by someone on LinkedIn with I see a fellow crypto bro or something like that, and it's like whatever gave you the idea? It's like no, I'm not falling for this scam, but thank you very much for showing me the usefulness for it. We are coming to an end of the episode. If you would be so kind, you focused on a really important mission of enabling, I would say, this mobile currency exchange in Africa, which I regret that we didn't speak more about it. I'm sorry I got so engaged with understanding what actually Bitcoin is and what it is not. So apologies, maybe I should prepare better, but for me it was absolutely enlightening. What other areas of application do you see? Like, if you would, have a friend say, listen, I think in year 25, this wonderful protocol will unlock, other kinds of services. I guess you cannot do everything by yourself. So maybe you feel like sharing some of the ideas. What could be done with this protocol when it will stop, when it no longer be just the manipulation tool?
Yes, there is a great website that I would like to point you to and your viewers to as well. It's the bsvblockchain.website. Now that is the Bitcoin Association, or BSV Association, is a non-profit organization based in Zug, Switzerland, and they are the one place that you can go to find more information about original Bitcoin blockchain. And also what's interesting is to see there is a page there which shows you all the companies in the world today that are looking at BSV blockchain for enterprise use. And what's amazing is how many different kinds of companies there are. It's not just payment companies. I mentioned supply chain. There's also advertising companies that can also use it to, instead of having the model where the platform charges the advertiser the money, what happens is the advertisers can then pay the viewers to view ads because they use microtransactions. There's also integrity. So, for example, digital certification. If you've got accreditations at universities, being able to create digital versions of that, or NFTs if you like, and then those credentials can be verified. Also, identity is very interesting because obviously identity isn't just your name. If you want to get into a place and you need to be over 18, for example, generally you show your ID. That place doesn't necessarily need to know your name or anything like that. And so what blockchain allows you to do, which is very exciting and interesting, is for you to be able to, in a way, keep your own data or have your own information, your own personal information.
You show them the card that has just this single bit of information that they can then compare to the database, and they get only what they are allowed to. Your age. Yes, this guy is over 18. So exactly. I see the benefit of for the privacy. It's amazing.
Yes, as well as other information. I mean, your identity isn't just who you are, but it's what you do. So maybe you have your social, your browser browsing histories, all the things that cookies generally track. You would be able to now retain that information instead of the website retaining that information, and then provide whatever is relevant to that business or that app so that they can use information. It's kind of like when you connect your, let's say, your Facebook account to another website, and then that website can see your friends and all that sort of thing. It's owning your own data, which is quite an interesting concept, where companies don't own your data and then monetize it. You can own your own data and monetize it as well. So at the end of the day, it's just a big distributed ledger. It's just a database that is global and that is private, and you can control what information people see. And it has an incredible number of enterprise use cases, as you will find if you go to the vsblockchain.org website.
I will link this website in the description of the episode. Okay, thank you very much, and as we always say here, let's hope it was of use to some.